asks me, because he knows I'm going to say yes, but, you know. But I was really praying and trying to figure out like what was supposed to be spoken about today, and the Lord brought me to the book of Daniel. So we're going to be spending a lot of time to the book of Daniel. So I'm just going to kind of dive right into it and give you some background. And there's going to be quite a few points on this, but we're only going to really go up to chapter 6. But don't worry, we're not going to read word for word everything. I'm going to do some paraphrasing for you. So in the book of Daniel, we're introduced to this ruler named Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar kind of took over the land from who I called King J, because I know I'm going to butcher his name, but it's up on the screen. So he kind of takes over this land, and when he takes it over, he seeks out the most purest, the most knowledgeable royals within that kingdom. And of these men comes 4. Daniel, who is later named Belshazzar, and then we have 3 other men who were later named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And those names will probably sound very familiar to you, but it was kind of cool for me to figure out that like Daniel was the same time as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he calls upon all of the people who is known to understand these dreams. These are people such as sorcerers and magicians, and basically, you know, people around the time who were called wise men who were trying to figure out this dream. And Nebuchadnezzar said, if you do not figure out this dream, I literally am going to kill you. So, you know, a lot of pressure with these wise men, but they do not understand the dream. They in fact say that no one of this world could understand the dreams in which he was given. So Nebuchadnezzar is a man of his word, and he sends Daniel to slaughter these people. And Daniel, we see in chapter 1, verse 14, kind of is very, very confused on why this decree is so incredibly, like, harsh. Like, he's asking, why in this world do you want me to slaughter these wise men? And he finds out that they are being slaughtered because they cannot figure out this dream. Well, Daniel then, we see, basically figures out a way to save these people, and he does this by figuring out the dream. So Nebuchadnezzar finds out that Daniel doesn't kill these wise men, and Daniel goes up to him and says, I will not slaughter these people, but I will tell you what this dream is about. So then we get into the dream, and Daniel makes it very clear that as he's interpreting the king, or the dream to the king, we see in chapter 2, verse 29, and I'll read that. He says to the king, actually verse 28, there is a God in heaven that revealeth the secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, my thoughts came unto thy mind, thy bed, when should come to pass hereafter, and he that revealeth the secrets made known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, the secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall be made known to the interpretation to the king, and thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. So before Daniel even starts figuring out this dream, he makes known his intentions. He makes it known that anything that is going to be revealed in this dream is not of him. It is what God has given him to interpret. So then Nebuchadnezzar tells him the dream. And the dream we see, starting in verse 31, chapter 2, Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part iron and part clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like a chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, that the stone smote the image, became a great mountain, and filled the earth. So to kind of break that dream down, he dreams of this head that was made of gold, and he sees these chests and arms of the being of silver. And then we see the legs of iron, and then the feet part iron of clay. And the most pivotal part of that dream is the rock that cuts into these objects are not of human hands. So Daniel interprets the dream, and he tells Nebuchadnezzar, after praying and after figuring out what this dream meant, that each piece of that being was a message. The head of gold represented Nebuchadnezzar. Then we have silver, which represented the kingdoms that were to come after his were not going to be as great. Same with the bronze that came next. Then we have the kingdom that was represented by iron, which destroys everything in its path as iron does. But then we have the feet, which is part iron and part clay, and that represented the fact that iron and clay do not mix, so this kingdom was going to be separated. There was nothing going to be that mixes them. It was going to create a lot of problems within that kingdom. But the rock that crushed everything, the rock that took down all of these elements, the rock that took down everything was not of human hands, and that was pivotal because God was telling Daniel that that part of that dream was that during all of those times of that kingdom, God is going to come down and he is going to set up a kingdom that is never going to fail. It's never going to fail. And the difference within this story is the fact that every single person that came down to interpret this dream was not of the intention of God. Like, doesn't that just blow your mind? That these people come and they try to figure out this dream and they know what's at stake. They literally were told that if they were not to understand this dream, that they would be killed. So a lot's on the line for them. And what's even more interesting is that, like, when you think about this, if you were those sorcerers or magicians who were come down, whose life was on the line, who was supposed to interpret this dream, wouldn't you think you'd make something up? I mean, come on. You would make something up because you don't want to die. But the reality of this dream is the fact that God blinded any interpretation because it wasn't of him. They had to have someone who was of God to come and interpret this dream, and that was Daniel. And Daniel told Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before they were supposed to kill the wise men to plead their life to God, to give their life to Christ, to that things were better in store as long as you have him in your life. And I think that is just so pivotal. And so now that this dream is out in the open, and Nebuchadnezzar finally figures it out, he falls on his face and worships Daniel. So we see that in chapter 2, verse 46, then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an obligation and sweet odors to him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldest reveal this secret. And then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief of governors over the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested of the king that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat at the gate of the king. I think that one of the greatest parts about this dream kind of reflects the challenges that we have as Christians. I think that there doesn't need to be a reason for everything that happens. And when you don't know the reason, there's a purpose for that. And we're always expected to kind of figure out everything that we need to know. But until God has that purpose for the things that you need to know, you are never going to know the exact answer. And that takes patience, and that takes a heart that is willingly and open to God. And we have so many resources at our fingertips these days. And we have so many things that we can look up and things to make sense of what we're trying to figure out. But sometimes you have to be careful because curiosity is not necessarily the best trait to have. We need to understand that when it is our time, when it is our message, when it is the things that we need to know in that time, God will give that to you. He will give that to you with a whole heart. Daniel knew the only way that he was going to save these people is so that way he could interpret that dream. He didn't just he's never done that before. He's never done that before, but he trusted in God's process through that dream that he was going to understand. He was going to save those wise men. And the greatest part about the whole thing is that God's kingdom will never be destroyed. It will never be destroyed. And isn't that great to know that we're a part of that? We do not have to be living when God's kingdom comes. We might be in one of those kingdoms that he describes. We might be in the iron. We might be in the clay. We might be in all of that. But the point of the matter is that we get to survive because we have God's love in us. We have his direction in us. You don't have to sit there and wait for God to come. God's already here. It's just, are you going to find him, or are you going to sit back and you're going to just let that go? If someone asks you a question, you don't have to know the answer. Daniel didn't know the answer right away until he prayed to God, and we'll see that later in the story too, which I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's go ahead and move on to chapter 3. So going back to the dream a little bit, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar represented what? The gold, right? He loved that. He loved that so much, he created a statue made of gold. And he told everybody that you have to worship that statue. He got cocky. He sure did. He got cocky, and he said, you know what? This gold represented me. I'm just going to embrace that. I'm going to make a statue, and all of you have to worship it. He missed the point. He missed the entire point of that dream. The entire point is that, his kingdom is not forever. God's kingdom is forever. But it didn't matter to Nebuchadnezzar because his mind was shut off. He thought that even though he was worshiping, notice that he did not worship the glory of the Lord when he gave that dream. He worshiped Daniel. He worshiped Daniel. He missed the entire point. So then in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar makes this image of gold. And for those of you who are familiar with Veggie Tales, you may remember the bunny story. So this is what we're talking about. It's the same thing. Just this is the Bible's version. So Nebuchadnezzar makes this image of gold, and he sets it up, and he says, everybody has to worship that. But guess who doesn't? You remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those same people that Daniel said you need to give your life to God? You remember them? Well, guess what? They did not worship that statue. And Nebuchadnezzar said that if you do not worship that statue, you are going to be thrown into a furnace and you are going to perish. That was the threat, was death. And and these people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were all handpicked at the beginning. We talked about how they were seen to be the most pure-hearted. They were seen to be the most knowledgeable. They were seen to be all of this greatness. But they chose to put God in their life, and that's going to help them in this story. So Nebuchadnezzar says, brings forth Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and says in verse 3:15. Now if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, pulsary, the disclaimer, and all kinds of music. So basically a whole bunch of instruments. Ye fall down and worship the image that I have made. Not that God has made, that I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye will be cast in the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? And we need to remember that Nebuchadnezzar was literally introduced to that God that's going to take them out of his hands. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we see verse 16, answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship thy golden image which thou hast set up. So Nebuchadnezzar is not really used to people defying him, so he really gets angry at this. And in fact, the threat was already there that they were going to be put in the fiery furnace, but that wasn't enough because these people are still deliberately disobeying him, worshiping that image, that he makes the furnace 7 times more, so 7 times hotter than it should be. And he says, go in the furnace, like you're going to be thrown into there, and you are going to perish because you're not following what I have put in place, because I am the gold. And so they go in there, and we see in verse 23, 3:23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake and said unto his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, O true, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth out of the fire. And they were not burned. Not a piece of them were scorned. They were perfect. The way that they came in, they came out too. And then verse 28, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god but their own. Therefore I make a decree that every people, every nation, every language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their house shall be made a dunghill, because there's no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So this is a prime example of what it's like to give your entire life to God. It shows that, he defines the odds, and I think that's why sometimes when we have people who are non-believers, they just can't wrap their head around God's glory and God's might, because it is just so crazy. I mean, to know that we have a God and we follow a God who will literally protect us in anything, no matter if they're going into a fiery furnace, no matter, you don't have to go into a fiery furnace in order to believe in God. God can still help you in your everyday matters. It's not different. It's not. And I am here to tell you that it's not, because the moment that we give our life and fully, wholeheartedly give our life to God and follow every single purpose that He has for us and follow every single decision He has in place for us to follow, that is going to be the difference. But the point of the matter is that they went against what was normal. It was normal to follow the king's word. It was normal to follow the things that he was put in place. But they went against that. They defied the odds. And yeah, I'm sure they were hated for that. But guess what? It doesn't matter, because we are still a part of that kingdom that's coming, that's going to reign forever and ever. And doesn't that just give you so much hope and so much fire for God? I mean, come on. This is not something to just ignore. His grace and his glory and his determination for the things, God will get what he wants. And whether or not you decide to be behind that is up to you. If you choose to blind yourself to things of this world and to things that just do not matter, you are not going to win. The only way that is going to set you forward is if you have God in your life, and not just having him in your life, but having him wholeheartedly all in your life. You don't just get to pick and choose when God's words and God's glory prevails. You don't get to just figure out on your own all the answers that you're trying to figure out. No. God's glory will deliver you. And what's also interesting is Nebuchadnezzar not only was introduced to God in this dream, not only did he literally see with his own eyes, like some people say seeing is believing. Come on, he had that. He literally lived through that. He literally saw with his own eyes, but that wasn't enough, because you see at the end, the key point to this story is the fact that he didn't say everyone will glory that God. He did not say everyone will bow their knees and glorify the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. No, he said if anyone says anything bad against this God, they're going to be punished. That's not wholeheartedly glorifying God. And I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar thought that was going to be enough. I mean, he's a king. Sometimes kings aren't going to put away their thrones. But we'll see this later in the next story. So Nebuchadnezzar is come to another dream we see, and we're going to be exploring chapter 4 in Daniel. So Nebuchadnezzar has a troubled vision, and again he calls upon all of these sorcerers and magicians. Did he not learn? I just sometimes I read these stories and I just laugh to myself, because you literally had your answer from one person, but yet he's trying again to reverse that and to put someone else in that place. So he goes over and he asks all these great people who are supposed to be magicians or whatever, and he figures out that, again, no surprise, they can't figure out the dream. And let me talk about this dream for a second. So we're going to look at verse 10 of chapter 4. And he calls on David at this point. So he finally is like, okay, well, Daniel gets called upon in this point because, he interpreted the last dream. So verse 10 says, "Thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, of the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height therefore reached unto the heavens, and the sight thereof to the end of the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, the fruit thereof much, and was meat for all. The beasts, the field, had shadows under it. The fowls of the heaven dwelt and brought thereof, and all flesh was fed on it. I saw the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher of an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said, Hew down the tree, cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and let the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with bound iron and brass, and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with dew of the heaven, and let his portions be with the beasts of the grass and the earth. Let his heart be changed from a man's and a beast, and let his heart be given unto him. Let 7 times pass over. And this matter is by the decree of the watchers, and demand the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know, and the high ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth to him whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the beasts of men. So, then we have Daniel being asked to talk about this dream. And we have a couple components in this dream. We have this large tree, which is super plentiful, super full of fruit, gives like everyone who would ever need anything what they need. But then we have this person coming down and saying, cut down the tree and leave the stump and bound it with iron and brass. Let him that be drenched with dew from heavens live among the wild animals, and the mind of that person will be changed, that the wild animal, and will be a wild animal until 7 times pass. So Nebuchadnezzar then interprets this dream. We have chapter 4, verse 19, where Daniel reveals to Nebuchadnezzar that this tree that they are talking about represents Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. But when they say, cut down the tree and let it be drenched with the dew of the heavens, he is saying that Nebuchadnezzar will be driven away from the people and will be made like a wild animal and be living among wild animals until he acknowledges that God is the kingdom that matters, and until he acknowledges that God is the whole reason for everything, and that the Lord in the heavens rule over everything, then will his kingdom be restored. And so God literally told Nebuchadnezzar that this kingdom's coming. He told Nebuchadnezzar by showing him his greatness. But he then shows him another dream that still has the same theme. Nothing has changed in this message to Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar praises Daniel again for figuring out this dream. But the difference is Daniel says in chapter 4, verse 27, wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee. Break off thy sins by righteousness and thine iniquities, and by showing mercy to the poor, if it be may a lengthening of thy tranquility. He's telling Nebuchadnezzar and warning him and saying, you should commit to God now, because this dream is going to be fulfilled. You need to commit to God. You need to show him. You need to bow down before him and realize that he is the Lord of lords. He is the King of kings, and he is going to reign over everything. And Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do it. He doesn't do it. He instead has this dream fulfilled. He is cast out by his kingdom. He is changed mentally to an animal, and he acts like an animal, and he eats among the grass with the oxen and whoever. He literally has this fulfilled for 7 times over, and not until he praises God do his servants seek him out. And you have to wonder, when Nebuchadnezzar was cast out by his kingdom, wouldn't you think back to that dream and realize, wouldn't you kneel down in that moment and be like, oh, I missed the point here, let me just get ahead of this, but he didn't. And sometimes that's how stubborn we are. We just don't get it. We don't want to get it. We don't choose to get it. We just choose to live the way that we're living because it's easy, because it's comfortable, because it's what is convenient at that time. But then we see in chapter 4, verse 34, and at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto the heavens, and mine understanding returned to me. I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him, and that liveth forever, whose dominion is everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is for generation to generation. So he finally praises God, and he gets his kingdom back. And then we see in verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are true and his ways judgment, and those that walk in the pride he is able to abase. So I just think it's so pivotal that we understand too that like God told Nebuchadnezzar what he had to do. He didn't make him suffer because he had the way out. He didn't suffer completely for he could have had that mind of an animal for years and years and years and years and never like leave that mindset. But God gave him a way out. He gave him a way out. He gave him the opportunity to redeem himself. And when he did, everything was restored. Everything was being made back to him. And we have to think about like the wise men and the people who were of sorcerers and whatever. They weren't killed. God showed them mercy because God teaches everyone around you as well what his grace does. He could have killed those wise men. They're not following God. But he showed them mercy by Daniel coming up and being able to tell him these dreams. Like that is what's so amazing about God. Sometimes you're not the main character in the story. Sometimes you're the people sitting around. So like wake up. Watch what's going around you. Watch what you're seeing. Watch what you're doing. Sometimes God speaks to us in different ways. And with Nebuchadnezzar, he finally found what was needed, and he was rewarded for that. So then we're going to explore chapter 5. So chapter 5, we are introduced to Belshazzar, which is a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar's Belshazzar, he takes over the kingdom, and I can't like explain him any more than he reminds me of like a teenager a little bit. So he takes all of these gifts and all of these sacred like entities, all of the silver and gold chastels, and he has these like the cups, and he has this huge party and like just parties it up, like just has a good time, just has a great time, and he invites all of his friends, and they're disrespecting what those things were put in place for, but they're doing it anyway. So, but then during the party, this hand takes this candlestick and starts writing on the wall. I mean, what a way to kill a party. I mean, So everybody's terrified. They're literally trembling because they're seeing this hand right on the wall with this candlestick. I mean, could you imagine that? Could you imagine witnessing that? I mean, yeah, exactly. So they are absolutely fearful. And the queen says, wait, there's this guy named Daniel who has helped in the past for dreams and visions and things like this. Like, let's call upon him and see what he has to say. So he comes in, and Belshazzar says, like, if you do this for me, you'll get all these gifts. And Daniel, in his humbleness, says no, he doesn't want any gifts, but he's going to talk to God about it. And this one took him a while to understand. It really troubled him, but he still was faithful in the fact that he still explored it through the intentions of God. He's still focused on what God's purpose for what they were seeing was. So I'm going to bring up chapter 5, verse 25, just so we can see those words that were written on the wall. So on the wall we have these three words, Mene, Mene, Tenkel, and I'm going to call the last one Perez because I don't know how to say that one. But it's when he describes it, he calls it Perez. But what is it? Upharsin. So Daniel looks at these words and he says the meanings. So Mene means that God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. God has basically counted down the days where his kingdom was going to be finished. And I want to, if you could just go back to verse 25. Verse 25, you can see that this is written twice. And I don't think that's something we should skip over. I think that's something that should have been a warning point, not just the first time it was written, but the fact that it was written twice. God has counted down the days when he was going to destroy that kingdom. And then Tenkel meant in verse 27, thou art weighted in balances and art found wanting. And then we see Perez means that thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Medes and the Persians. So think back to that dream. Remember how it was said that one of the kingdoms was going to be divided? This was that kingdom. And so after that was done, Belshazzar clothed Daniel with all of these scarlets and golds and was proclaiming him and all this stuff. But guess what? That night he was slain. That night he was killed. He was destroyed. And he didn't take the warning signs. He just was like, yeah, Daniel, thank you so much for telling me this. This is great. We can go back to partying. He was killed that same night because he didn't listen. It was written twice that God had counted down the days where he was going to be destroyed, and he didn't listen, and he instead continued doing whatever he was doing, and he was destroyed because of it. So then we're finally going to explore chapter 6, and I know that I'm running out of time. Just getting started, but running out of time. But we'll explore chapter 6 now. So Darius was the one who took over after Belshazzar. He's the one who conquered him. And so now Darius is the king of this place. So Daniel was very well loved in the kingdom. He was very respected, and that is not only because of his knowledge, not only because he was picked to be someone who was perfect or knowledgeable, but he was known because of his spirit, because he had the word of God in him. And some people just didn't like that. I mean, I'm sure that can be relatable. Some people just don't like that. And so these presidents and princes came together and they plotted against Daniel. They needed to figure out a way to destroy him. They needed to figure out a way to get him out. And they couldn't find any reason. They couldn't find anything to put him on trial. They couldn't find anything. And I related to this a little bit because sometimes we really don't like people and we don't have a real reason why we don't like them. We just feel like we don't like them. And so I really feel like that was kind of what they were going for. But so they convince Darius and they say, hey, I think you should have this law put in place that if anyone worships anything other than you, they should be put in the lion's den for a month. And Darius is like, yeah, that's great. That's a great idea. So he signs that, and it does not change. Well, Daniel was one of those people who worshipped something different than the king. He worships God about 3 times a day, and he's caught doing this. And he's brought before Darius. And as soon as Darius sees that Daniel is the one that's being convicted, he immediately regrets his decision. And that's what makes Darius different, because Darius didn't just go by the laws that he put in place. He knew that Daniel was a man of God. He knew that he was something bigger, a part of something bigger than what was there. And he regretted it. And what's so funny about this story is we see in chapter 6, verse 15, then when he says, no, I don't want to do this, I want to retract it, this does not exist anymore, I don't want this. In verse 15, the princes and presidents who helped him sign this decree to put in place, says in verse 15, these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute of which the king established may be changed. And I think that's funny because if you're the king, you should be able to do whatever you want. And that's what stopped him from saving Daniel. But a different thing about Darius too is that he says to Daniel, we see in verse 16, the king commanded, they brought to Daniel and cast him unto the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. Amen. Again, something different about Darius is that he knew who God was. He knew what God was capable of. And he told Daniel, like you're going to be protected. It's going to be okay. And he was so guilted by having Daniel be thrown into the lion's den that he was the reason for that he lost sleep over it, and he just fasted, and that month must have been really hard for him. And then we see when he goes over, once the month has finished, verse 20, he came to the den and he cried unto Daniel and spake and said, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? And Daniel said unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent an angel and hath shut the lions' mouth, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me. And also before thee, O king, I have done no hurt. Then the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. And Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner was hurt upon him, because he believed in his God. And then it is declared after that Darius says, verse 25, Wrote unto all the people and nations and languages that dwell in the earth, and peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my king men tremble and fear the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall ever be unto the end. He delivered and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heavens and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel spent a whole month with these lions, and not a single one touched him. Not a single one hurt him. Not a single one shed his blood. And that is because God protected him in that whole situation. And it's very similar. We see the similarities with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were thrown in these situations that were meant to kill him, but God's people always prevail. They always prevail. And this is a prime example of that. And Darius's new decree said that people shall fear the God that saved Daniel, and they shall know that he is the living God. So after all of these people, all of these rulers were finally gone, it took Darius to finally wake up and for people to see what was needed in the land. And so I want to kind of close out on a couple verses. If we could just go to Psalms 112. Right. So Psalms 112 talks about the man who fears God. And I'm just going to read this. It says, Praise the Lord. Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord, that delighteth greatly in his commandments. His seed shall be mighty upon the earth. The generation of the upright shall be blessed. Wealth and riches shall be in his house, and his righteousness endureth forever. Unto the upright there ariseth light in the darkness. He is gracious and full of compassion and righteousness. A good man sheweth favor, and lendeth. He will guide his affairs with discretion. Surely he shall not be moved forever. The righteous shall be everlasting in his remembrance. He shall not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is fixed, trusting in the Lord. His heart is established. He shall not be afraid until he sees his desire upon his enemies. He hath dispersed, he hath given to the poor. His righteousness endureth forever. His horn shall be exalted with honor. The wicked shall see it, and be grieved, and shall gnash with his teeth, and melt away, and the desire of the wicked shall perish. If you don't take anything from today, the one thing that you should is the fact that those who wholeheartedly believe in God will always prevail. And those who are wicked will always be cast. And those who are wicked will never prevail. Those who did not follow God's purpose did not live. They were cast out. They were put to death. But when you have God in your life, He will always show you the way out. He will always show you how to combat that. And that is based on the difference if you actually listen. Some of the hardest parts about being a Christian is putting yourself aside and just listening to what God has in store for you. Just listening to what He wants you to do. Just listening to the answers that you need to know and not want to know. He will always be there for you. And yeah, sometimes it's not what's wanted, and sometimes, yeah, like you may be cast out by your peers, or you may be talked down to because you show this love of God, but guess what? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because the difference is when you have God in your life, you will always be fulfilled. If you think back to times where you were doing things not for God's purpose, did you ever feel great about that? Did you ever feel like you solved that problem? Did you ever feel like it was done? No, because unless you have the intentions of God, you are never going to do the purpose that you need to do. You are never going to make the things happen that need to be made happen. And how awful is it to think that, like, just because you are so stubborn and you don't want to listen to what God has in store for you, you're going to be missing out. Like, that is in your will to choose Him. That is in your will to choose that plan. That is in your will. But it's also in your will to run away from it. So you have to choose what you want to do. You have to choose what the Lord is giving you. And in Psalms 46:1, we had a couple verses that we had to memorize in Sunday school. Shout out to Stephanie. But two of the verses that I always use, Psalms 46:1, which says that God is my refuge and strength and ever-present help in time of trouble. And then we also see in 1 Corinthians 10:13, the temptations in your life are no different than what others experience, but God is faithful and He will always show you a way out so you can endure. Amen. And so I just want to leave you with that things are going to be hard sometimes, but you have God in your life and you have the ability to listen to Him, and you have the ability to say no to things that you know are not right, and you have the ability to choose whether or not you're supposed to know certain things, because God has a purpose for you, and unless you listen to that purpose, you're never going to be fulfilled with that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and then Mr. Larry, if you could pray over the tithes and offerings too. But we're just going to pray. So, Lord, I just thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I thank you for the guidance that you have shown me during this message, Lord. Just help us open our hearts to you, open our minds to you, and do what we are meant to do in order to fulfill the way that you have for us. In your name, amen.
Thank you, ma'am. Wasn't that excellent? Wasn't that just excellent? I when I see somebody that's hungry for the Lord, they always put out a good banquet, and you always get to eat real well. And as you all know, I like chicken, and I don't like leaving anything on the bones. So I might just nibble a little bit more at the bones just for a second here. But one thing about the kingdoms is they all fell. Man's kingdoms will all fall. And God's kingdom will remain. His kingdom is at hand. It's here now. But God's kingdom will remain. And we can strive as much as we want to excel in the kingdoms of the earth, or we can try to excel in the kingdoms of God. Which one will we be left holding at the time of the end, right? And another thing that comes to mind here is all the rulers come and go. And how they relate to God not only affects them, but it also affects their people. Look at this tree that was cut down. The tree went down. Don't you think everybody that inhabited that tree also suffered because of it being cut down? I mean, we could talk a long time because Madelyn really teed up a lot of stuff, and it was really good. But what I do think is we're living in a time right now that is a type of what Daniel was living, what Daniel wrote about. Isn't this true? And so this is a word for today. It's a word for us not to fear, and we don't want to fear. Fear not, for I go before you, right? And he does. Our Lord and our Savior is before us, and he is our Savior. And what did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say? You know what? We're not bowing down, and we don't care if we die, because our God is everlasting, right? In other words, I don't remember the exact words, but I do know that they would not get rid of their faith because of their love for God and their faithfulness. That is what must remain. Another thing that you brought up that was really excellent is that even when we're going through these times of troubles and things like that, we don't have to be afraid because God's got it. God's got it, everything in his hands, right? It's so true. He's got everything, and we have to apprehend it, like Pastor Danny says. We got to grab onto it and just hold it, and just grab him and hold on to him. I have a dream sometimes. I like this thing, the Revelations, the type that we're in, was a vision and a dream, wasn't it? That's where God communicates like that, and he communicates with all of us like that at different times, I think. But I will say this. You talked about the pride. You see a great deal of pride in world leaders, not just then, but now, right? And pride cometh before the fall. He who exalteth himself shall be humbled. He who humbles himself shall be exalted. And I like the verse you brought up that said he is able to abase the proudful, the pride, right? So this is also so excellent. And these are take-home points that we have to. I'm just nibbling at the bones. You put out such a good, nice, tasty meal. I'm just still eating, man, because I don't want to give it up. You guys always see me eating, later on, right? But I really enjoyed this, and I enjoyed your faithfulness. I enjoyed your hunger. It's wonderful to see that in the house of the Lord. It's wonderful to see it in the younger generations. It's necessary because you guys will carry the torch. You ladies do. And let's give her a hand, all right? Can we all give her just a nice hand? Yeah. All right. And now, without further ado, I'm going to go with my instructions to pray over the tithes. But I couldn't help myself. I had to say a few things. But remember, we're in those times, and the test will come, but we'll pass the test in Him, in Him. And now is the time for preparation. Now is the day of salvation. Now is the time for us to bind with our Lord. And how do we do that? We do that in the Word, right? That's the banquet. That's what we eat. And we will not hunger when we eat. We will not thirst when we drink from that ever-living water, right? So that's what we need. Nothing else matters. Oh, and I can't help myself. I love the music. And the music ministry is oftentimes a witness to what the Word is. So I just wanted to share one thing with you real quick. Victory is yours. How cool is this? The victory is yours. You're riding on the storm. Your name is unfailing. There's the kingdom, right? That's him. Though kingdoms rise and fall. How cool. Madeline, did you know that we're going to sing this today? You knew, didn't you? Your throne withstands it all. Your name is unshaken. How cool is that? That's the message at the end, isn't it? I wanted to bring this up because I was thrilled when you started out like, yeah, this is really good. I can't help myself. I get excited. But I love you all. I love everybody here very, very much. That's the body, right? That's the love God has given for us, the grace and mercy that he gives us, so that we can extend the love that he puts in our hearts. It's all about him. He authors everything good. Everything